Hello guys and welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today we're back in the gorgeous Peak District once again as always, and we've come to capture a sunset shot of a really beautiful location that I've not been to before. It's called Belhag Barn and it's quintessentially the Peak District. It really does scream the Peak District. Now it's a blue sky day today. There's no wind. It's gorgeous, it really is, and this December sun is golden and illuminating the landscape. I'm not here to capture the sky, so I'm not worried about the blue sky at all. I'm here to capture the contours of the landscape and also some gorgeous autumn colours down in the valley below. I'm just going to go through this gate. There we go. So today's episode is going to be a shoot, edit and print episode. So I'm going to take the shot, I'm going to talk you through what I'm going to be doing, and then I'm going to head back to the studio, get it edited and then print it out and see what we come up with. So join me at the location guys, and we can get set up because that sun is dipping down rapidly. So let's get this sorted out. Wow, the sun is just dipping behind the ridgeline now. Literally I had about 5 minutes since I last spoke to you. Quickly set the camera from the tripod down there and grabbed a shot with a wider lens, so I was quite close to the barn itself. And I think that worked quite well. And the idea I think is probably a 16:9 crop. That was what I was thinking when I was taking the shot. Didn't really have any time for any panos or anything like that. It was just a case of taking the shot. As you can see now, the sun is just literally dipping down. Then I decided to come further up the hill and see if I could get the longer lens on, get a bit more of an aerial perspective of the barn, see if I could, compose it a little bit better. I want to get the trees in the barn just a little bit different, with the trees behind as well, with a bit of separation in the valley. So that was my thought process. I've managed to get the two different shots. And the only problem being is when I was down there, the light was in the valley and it was looking great. When I've come up here, the sun has just been a little bit too low to get the light down into the valley, so I didn't get that gorgeous light hitting all the different areas of the hills and the rooftop of the barn there. So I was a bit disappointed about that. But that being said, I think I've experimented with two different compositions. I can always come back another time, but I do think I've got a good shot down the bottom there. So we're going to get packed up now and get back to the studio. I can't believe how quickly the light has just dipped down. It's unbelievable, literally 10 minutes. It looked like a good couple of feet above the ridgeline there, and it's just dipped down. But yeah, beautiful evening, really is. Can't believe how stunning it's been today, start of December. So yeah, we're going to get the gear packed up and I'll see you back at the studio and we'll get stuck into these edits, guys. So what a gorgeous evening that was. Incredibly beautiful light there, and a lovely walk from Lady Bower Reservoir in the Peak District up to Belhag Barn. And I learned some valuable lessons while I was there too about light, and I'll share those with you at the end while the image is printing out. But so let's just quickly talk about the first spot. I just couldn't get the perspective I needed. Obviously, like I said in the field, I wanted to use a 16:9 crop for this. So if we just select 16:9, I'll just show you why I was struggling to compose this shot. Really, I wanted to try to get the barn in the bottom right hand third, but obviously it meant if I did that, I was incorporating some of the sky into the shot. That is when I decided to move up further up the hill. I quickly ran up and recomposed the shot quite a bit further up. Initially I was standing around about here, roughly where that sheep is actually. So I've moved quite further back up the hill, and that's given me a much better perspective. I'm able to look down into the valley. I can position the barn in the right hand third there, the bottom right hand third. I've also got plenty of room above, just not to include any of that sky. And obviously because I'm zoomed in a bit more as well, got the telephoto lens on. What that's done, it's compressed the distance between my foreground element, which is the barn, and the trees as well, so it's brought them forward in the scene, adding some nice texture. So we don't see the rest of the hills, and this is really nice. And the first thing that I'm going to do to this image is crop it. So I'm going to choose a 16:9:9 ratio because that's what I envisaged at the time, that's what I wanted to do, and I'm just going to bring the crop in a little bit over these trees. I didn't want to disturb the sheep, so I decided just to crop out. I know I've lost a little bit of resolution in the width there, but I'm not too worried about that. So that's my initial setup for the shot. Now, as you can see, while I've moved up the hill, the light's gone out of the valley floor, but actually it's still hitting all of these trees and the tops of these trees as well. So today, to get this photo ready for print, I'm essentially going to be doing some dodging and burning techniques, and I'm going to be manipulating some of the colours in the photograph. So nothing too drastic, but these techniques can really help your photograph and improve the overall look. So as you can see, the foreground here is extremely bright, but the valley floor is quite dark. But if you look carefully, you can see some gorgeous light hitting the tops of all of these hills here and some nice deep shadows. So that information is there, we just need to bring it out. And that light is probably being reflected off some clouds in the background, just coming down, so it's a lovely directional light hitting the valley floor. And actually, light like this can sometimes be a lot easier to work with in post-production than harsh light that we've got here in the foreground. So first off, we're going to make a little bit of an adjustment to the temperature. I'm just going to bring that down a fraction just to cool the shadows down a little bit. But we're going to make some more adjustments to the colour in a minute. We're going to boost the exposure quite a bit, and this is going to look horrible to start with, but that is going to be darkened in a second when we look at some of the other sliders. I'm going to boost the contrast to +13, somewhere around about there. And now I'm going to bring the highlights down a bit to around about -25. Shadows I'm going to pull up a bit to +36, 35, 37, something like that. That looks good. And I'm just going to bring those whites up a little bit. And then I'm going to bring the blacks down a lot. Somewhere around about there. So as you can see, the exposure is starting to balance itself out again. And we've picked up a little bit more detail here in the shadow area. I'm just going to push up the texture to +1 and the clarity to around about +4, just to give it a bit more punch. Vibrance I'm going to push up about 14, somewhere around about there, and then saturation to around about +21. Now, I know this looks awful at the minute, and that's to be expected because we're going to be desaturating a lot of the image, but we're going to be doing that in the HSL. So at this stage we can see what colours we've got and what we want to take away, and then we can start adjusting our colour palette. I'm going to add a tone curve to this image as well, just a medium tone curve. Quite a bit of contrast to the image. Now it's starting to look quite garish at the minute, but don't worry about that. This is where the magic is going to happen. First of all, I'm going to come down to my split toning, and I'm going to add some warm highlights to this image. If you drag the saturation slider across at the bottom, it just makes it a little bit easier to get the right colour for your split toning. So this is just adding that kind of orange shade to the highlights, and then I'm just going to bring that down until I'm happy, somewhere around about there. Again, still looking very frightfully garish at the minute, but that is all going to be adjusted now in the HSL. So we're going to be working with these colours, and we're going to be taking some of the colours out of the image to simplify the colour palette a little bit. So I want to push the reds more to the orange. I'm going to do that at the top here in the hue section. The yellows I'm going to push a little bit more towards the orange. Greens are going to push over towards the yellows. The aquas I'm going to push more towards the greens, and I'm happy with those at the minute. Saturation I'm going to bring down the reds quite a bit, and I want to take some of the reds out of the image. I don't want too many reds in this image. I do like the oranges though, because we're trying to enhance those autumn colours, so I'm just going to boost the saturation of the oranges up a little bit. The yellows I'm going to bring down a fraction. The greens are going to bring down quite a lot because the greens are very garish in this shot, so I want to bring those tones of those greens down a fair bit. -27. I don't like my greens to be overly green, so I do tend to desaturate my greens. The aqua I'm just going to bring down a fraction somewhere there. Blue I'm going to bring down quite a bit. Now, as we can see in this image, there's quite a lot of purple and magenta. We tend to get that late autumn in the pine trees and the silver birch trees. And I'm not a massive fan of purple and magenta in my images. It kind of conflicts with the colour palette, I feel. So I generally reduce saturation of my purples. So now I'm coming down to the luminance section, and this essentially adjusts the brightness of each individual colour. So I'm just going to boost the reds up a little bit. I want to try and bring out some of these autumn colours in the leaves in these trees. The oranges I'm going to increase around about somewhere there. Yellows I'm going to increase, and this is just how bringing out all of the details in these areas of the tops of the trees here, because obviously these are yellow, so if we increase the luminance of the yellow, it's going to make these pop out just a little bit more. I'm going to reduce the luminance of the greens, so I'm dropping that down a fair bit, somewhere around 30, and the colour palette now is looking a lot better. It's a lot more pleasing to the eye, so I'm really pleased with that. The next stage is to do some local adjustments. So we can see the image is looking a lot better now, but obviously this area here is not looking great at all. So I'm going to use an adjustment brush for this section, and it's going to be the first thing that I do. So I'm just I'm going to do this really crudely, but obviously you guys could take a lot longer. If you hit O on your keyboard, you can see the mask and where you're painting, and if you hold Alt, you can take away that mask. So sometimes I'll paint over it really quickly and crudely, and then just paint out the sections that I don't want. I find that a bit easier, to be honest. And if you press O on the keyboard, that just takes that mask away. So I want to reduce the highlights of this section here, and also the exposure, and also the saturation as well. What I want to try and do is get this area looking very similar to this area. So by reducing the saturation of that, it's just bringing that down to this area and kind of matching that. I also want to reduce a little bit of the contrast as well, because the sun was directly on this foreground area, and obviously with the light being on it, there's a lot more contrast in that. So I'm just going to take the contrast down this, and as you can see now, it's very similar to what we've got here in the valley floor, which is what I was after. So next up, I'm going to be applying some radial filters to this image. Radial filters are absolutely brilliant. They give you so much control. You can drag and drop your radial filter over your image. You can even move it around a little bit by just dragging that around, increase the size of it. It's probably a little bit too big. Now, when you select this, everything outside of the circle is going to be affected. So essentially I'm going to put a bit of a vignette on this image, so I'm just going to bring that down a little bit, just increase the blacks. It's just a fraction, and that's just drawing the eye into this focal area in the middle here. Don't want to do it too much, so I'm happy with that. Now I'm going to put another radial filter here in the middle, but this time I'm going to invert the radial filter so it just affects everything inside the circle. So I'm just going to increase the exposure, bring in a lot of contrast, and increase the saturation of this valley floor. Also going to enhance the highlights a little bit, which is going to bring out some of the light hitting the tops of these mounds of grass here. I'm going to push up the shadows a little bit as well, and add a little bit of clarity. Now the focal point of this image is the barn here, so I really want to increase the exposure, the clarity and the saturation of this barn, just so you know what you're meant to be looking at. So again, I've got to invert the radial filter, increase the exposure on it, really boost the saturation, just to give it a bit of colour because it's looking a bit flat, and the clarity also. So So this is just helping draw the eye towards that barn. And this is essentially dodging and burning. That's something that's been done in photography right back to the film days. And you know, it's just a case of not overdoing it, because you want the image to look as natural as possible. Next up, I'm going to drop a radial filter down here in the background. I just want to add in a little bit of depth to the shadows here, so I need just to invert that. Just want to darken those shadows down a bit and also add some saturation, because there's a lot of colour in this area, and I'm also going to warm it up a fraction. That's nice. Now what I did find, there's a couple of areas where the colour in the image has been affected and it looks a bit unnatural, and this was one of the areas. And that's something you have to watch when you're doing messing around with your colours in the HSL. Sometimes you can add in some weird looking colour areas. This area down here is frosty, but you can see it's overly green in places. So I'm just going to remove the saturation in this area until I take away those green patches. Now, to accentuate the tops of these trees, I'm going to add in another radial filter. I just want to bring out all those lovely areas of light hitting the top of these trees, and I'm just going to invert my mask again, just to increase the temperature, just to increase the light, the colour of the light hitting the tops of these trees. Now I'm going to boost the whites as well, and that's really going to bring out the detail in those, in that light. You want to accentuate that autumn colour just hitting the top of these trees here. That looks really nice. Just going to decrease the blacks a little bit just to boost that contrast. I'm just going to bring up the highlights too, and then I'm going to add in some saturation. And that's really helping, just the light there hitting the tops of those trees, which is really nice. The last thing that I'm going to do in terms of filters is just drag down the gradient filter just to darken that down, just to help your eye wander to the barn at the bottom there. And now I've adjusted everything, I'm just going to come back to my adjustment brush and adjust this foreground a little bit, because I still think it's just a little bit oversaturated. So I'm just going to bring that saturation down of that, and that's balancing a little bit better now. Yeah, much prefer that. That's looking great. So I'm trying to balance this foreground with the midground. And that's starting to look really nice now. I'm really pleased with that. There's a few things I'd like to do as well to this image, and that's remove the sheep. There's a bin there. Obviously the farmer's got some food in there. And there's also a small sheep there. Now, you could do this in Lightroom by hitting the spot removal tool. It does a fairly good job. You do have to be a bit careful with it, but as you can see, it does a relatively good job. But I prefer to do any cloning or spot removal in Photoshop. I'm not going to take this image into Photoshop today because I think it's going to make the video too long, but essentially the only other things I've got left to do to this image really are just to remove the sheep, the two sheep and the bin, and add some sharpening in. But for the sake of the length of the video, I'm not going to do that. You could do those steps in Lightroom, as I've just explained. The image is looking really nice now, and I think it looks great on the screen, but there's a few things we need to do to make it a print-worthy image. We need to make sure that what we see is what we get. Having already done a test print of this shot, I've added a few adjustments to make this image pop on paper. And basically what I've done is I've increased the exposure by half a stop, and I've increased the saturation by +7, and then I just dropped in a very small radial filter on the building again, just to increase the exposure, decrease the blacks a little bit, just to get a bit more punch. And as you can see, it probably looks a little bit overdone for the screen, but for print sometimes you just have to make a few adjustments to get it looking really good. So now we're ready to take it to print. I'm just going to open Canon Print Studio Pro up, plug in extras, and that's going to open Print Studio Pro. There's that image, soft proofing's enabled, so this is we're going to be printing this image on platinum etching from photo speed, and I'm absolutely in love with this paper. Absolutely love it, it's brilliant. It's my favourite paper I think I've ever used. I've put in my profile from photo speed, and that's given us an idea of what it's going to look like. So this image is ready to print, and I am going to go ahead and print this image. So I think the print's turned out really well. I'm really pleased with it. I couldn't have wished for anything better from that location. It really does look nice. And I think I learned a few lessons, like I said at the beginning, while I was there. And it was really to do with the light and the position of the light on the landscape. Now, when I was walking down, you might have seen me walking down the hill, and I probably, came down around about 100 feet to where Belhag Barn, is actually situated. And as I was there, the sun was quite high in the sky, and as I come down, obviously the sun's getting lower, and I'm getting lower too. And the barn, had light all over it. The bottom of the valley floor had light all over it. Now, I was quite happy where the sun was, and as I moved up the hill, I was kind of looking back towards the sun. And when I moved up to the location where I was taking the photograph, I would say the sun was a couple of feet above the ridge line. So, the light was on the valley floor. Everything looked fantastic. Now, what I didn't really take into consideration is when I moved further up the hill to get my new composition, obviously as I was travelling up, the sun was dropping down, but because I was going up to where the sun was 2 feet above the ridgeline, that kind of maintained that distance because I was travelling up and the sun was travelling down. But what I didn't take into consideration when I was faffing around, setting my tripod up, getting the camera on the tripod and everything, was the fact that the light was completely gone from the valley floor. Because I just kept looking around at the sun thinking, oh yeah, it's still above the ridgeline. But I didn't take into consideration the fact that I was probably 150 feet above the valley floor. So if I was on the valley floor, I wouldn't have been able to see the sun. So it's something that I think was really important for this shot. As it turns out, I think the light that I got was better. Had that light been on the barn and on all of these contours in the midground, I don't think the image would have been as good. So you could say I got a bit lucky actually, and being able to manipulate the contrast, the saturation and the detail in that midground there, I think I might have struggled if it was in harsh sunlight. So I think this lighting was almost perfect actually, because I've got the light in the trees and the branches there are so bright, and they're all covered in this green moss, and I'm really pleased with how the light's catching the trees, and it really screams autumn. As you can see in the background there, some of the needles have fallen from the pine trees, and that adds just a really plain texture to the backdrop of this image. And I was able to take away some of that harsh brightness in the foreground as well, and just accentuating the light on the barn itself has really helped make that the focal point of the image as well. So you know what to look at, but you also see this gorgeous light in the trees. I think it's a location I will definitely go and visit again in the future. I think it could be a great spot for a winter shot. If there's snow on the hills, I think that could look amazing. So I'm definitely going to revisit this one more than once probably. So if you've got any comments or anything you think you'd like to add, please do share them in the comment section below. I'll get back to every comment, and I really appreciate your time commenting. It means the world to me, it really does, and it really inspires me to get out and shoot and create more stuff. So thank you so much for your time guys. Please like, subscribe, share and all that good stuff, and I'll see you next week. Take care.